Well, it's good to be with you this morning. And
Glad to have you.
thank you, sir. Appreciate it. I've driven by here many times on my way up to Dodge and thought about all the churches. You have quite a few churches here in Colton, and it'll be a blessing for us just to be here and to celebrate this time with you. So this morning we're in Psalm 55. And you may not be familiar with that psalm, but it's, by the way, the first song that we heard this morning really ties in well with what the message is. So we're looking at how we might get a better insight and more wisdom into faithful living in light of the circumstances that come into our lives this morning. How do we best understand how to respond to our troubling life circumstances as we contemplate our relationship to God and His sovereignty in our life? If you're not aware of it, Psalm 55 is one of the lament psalms. There are 13. It's a song about mourning and grieving about something. I always think of the Psalms as God's words to men about men's words to God. God is telling us the things that men say to God in their prayer life and in their anxiety about their life, knowing who He is. And as I read Psalm 55, I get the impression here that God is giving His church permission to express the fullest possible range of emotional feelings that we experience in our souls. And I do mean the fullest possible range of emotions expressed to God openly. I love what one author said about the lament psalms. It's a curious statement. She said, there's an intense honesty in the lament psalms that can run as close to blasphemy as one can imagine within the context of prayer. That shows you how open our anxiety can be with God at times. But I think that's the problem for the church today in our culture. I think it's hard for us to think in terms of talking to God the way that David talks to God in the lament psalms. See, we don't have any problem with the Thanksgiving Psalms. We love to do that and thank God for His providence. Or the praise Psalms where we lift up His name. Or the trusting Psalms where we learn to trust Him in light of all of our circumstances. And even the wisdom Psalms. Those are no problem Psalms for us. But the individual lament Psalms, those are a problem for the church. And they're a problem because they remind us of something that we're really uncomfortable with. You see, the lament psalms enable us to bring into our conversation with God feelings and thoughts that most of us think that we need to get rid of before God will be interested in hearing from us. But folks, here's the message in Psalm 55. You can't pray the lament psalms and be nervous about being too emotional or too honest in your conversation with God regarding the dark surprises that often come along in our walk of faith. And what we see David doing here in Psalm 55 is bringing the level of his emotion up in line with the intensity of his prayer. Because here's the truth of the matter. See, David doesn't pray this way. Lord, it's okay with me if you deliver them into the pit alive. That isn't how David prays. David prays this way: Lord, drag them away from their happy lives at the health spa and throw them down into the pit of hell right now, and don't let any of them enjoy another minute of their lives. Do it now. But how many of us are willing to pray that way to God? I know my wife isn't, and I'm not either most of the time. So the lament psalms really are a witness to the reality of the full-orbed faith that shares a really deep intimacy with God. And these psalms express a wide range of emotions that our souls sometimes experience, from anywhere from the ravaging guilt of a repeated sin problem that we can't get around, to despondent grief or loss or hurt that someone might have caused us, which we see in this psalm this morning. And see, lament isn't simply being annoyed or irritated because you're in a bad mood. It's much more deep and serious than that. It isn't simply complaining about something that's really relatively inconsequential. Biblical lament expresses misery and mourning over the heartache and the disaster that happens in our world. Lamenting openly expresses the kind of ache that we feel we can only really express at a funeral. But the lament psalms give us God's permission to speak to God about how we really feel about the pain and sorrow that often accompanies this life of faith. So the lament songs are anguished cries of sorrow and grief and anger that we're hesitant to express before God when we are disoriented from Him because of the kind of experiences that we're having. And the reason I mentioned God's permission, because in Psalm 55 you get the impression that it never crosses David's mind that it's inappropriate or offensive to talk to God the way he's talking to Him. And where David will acknowledge his sinfulness in his own life in many of the other Psalms, he has no intention of apologizing to God about the way he's talking to Him in these lament Psalms. You get the impression that David is certain that this is an acceptable way to talk to God, especially when life throws hand grenades in your path that you weren't expecting. So let's look for just a minute before we get into the psalm. We want to look at the verses carefully, but let's look for a minute just at the kind of general pattern that lament psalms take. So lament psalms often begin with some kind of emotional cry against some deplorable condition or some kind of circumstance, or some cry against a personal tragedy or an injustice that's happened to us. And then that turns into talking to God about the mourning and the grieving we're experiencing because we're suddenly completely disoriented in our relationship with the Lord because of the extent of this emotional experience that's been dropped on us. There's an unexpected pain and emotional struggle that comes in this experience, and we don't feel we relate to God quite the same way we were before the experience. And then that winds up into sort of filing a complaint humbly before God and actually saying things to God like, God, I know that you know I'm in trouble, so why aren't you rescuing me? That's the kind of way that the lament psalms talk to God. And then we begin to ask God, how should we feel in light of who He is in this experience we're having and what His promises actually promise us? And then lament psalms, interestingly, they kind of work themselves out this way. When you honestly begin to talk to God about the pain or the grief or the sorrow or the anxiety you're feeling in your experience, and you're candid about your misery and you're sincere about the loss that you've experienced, after you've expressed that, then you begin to get reoriented to God again in spite of the experience. And you begin to have confidence again that it's okay that you're experiencing that because you know who God is. Lament psalms kind of get us back on track with God after we've been through some kind of derailing, dreaded experience. And so it's when we are openly and honestly talking to God about our pain or our anger or our grief that enables us to walk back into the spiritual state of trusting and relying on Him again. So you go through a whole cyclical idea here in the lament psalms. They give us permission to use words to express our pain to God, but then they lead us out of that pain by God's strength and a reconnection to His character. And almost all of the lament psalms resolve themselves into prayers of hope, which we see in this psalm this morning, as they remind us that We belong to God in spite of every circumstance that we have. Lament is a biblical way to worship that we've fallen out of touch with as the church. God gives us permission to talk to him exactly the way we feel. And that works its way through our experience so that we come back into a relationship with God where we're trusting in him again. And the truth of the matter is, no matter what the experience is that we're having, God is our only refuge. There's no other place to go. He's where we find our rest, even in the midst of really troubling experiences. He's the one refuge who will sustain us and protect us as we live out our life of faith that brings us difficult circumstances. So as we think through the purpose of Psalm 55 this morning, I want you to know as a congregation that whatever way you're feeling about this walk of faith is okay. Expressing all of those feelings to God about how you're really feeling at the real level that you're feeling them is what Psalm 55 is permitting us to do. So let's think for a minute about the psalm. It's important to acknowledge that this is a maskil psalm. There are 13 maskil psalms, and the word sakal is in the word maskil. And it means to understand something so that you'll prosper from it. It's called the contemplation of David. And it means that you should look for an intelligent knowledge for the reason for something. In a maskil psalm, the author is asking you to think through a complex arrangement of thoughts that will give you wisdom and common sense about something that you're struggling with. So these maskil psalms are groups of psalms that are composed for worship, but they're also teaching psalms that have the added benefit of compelling us to be wise and godly as we read through the psalm. So maskil, the idea of maskil represents insight or the skillful use of wisdom as we're attentive to what the author is saying to God. So it's a call for the reader to pay attention, to get a real sound understanding of the words, that there's some kind of godly wisdom that we need to mine from that psalm. There's some eternally significant wisdom that's to be gained by contemplating what the author is saying to the Lord. So David would like us to be prepared to be wiser this morning because of our time in Psalm 55. So let's just discover how honest and emotional David is as he urges us to talk to God about our pain the way he talks to him. So I'm reading out of the New King James Version, Psalm 55. The heading says, "Trust in God concerning the treachery of friends. To the chief musician with stringed instruments, a contemplation of David." Verse 1, "Give ear to my prayer, O God, and do not hide yourself from my supplication. Attend to me and hear me. I am restless in my complaint, and I moan noisily because of the voice of the enemy, because of the oppression of the wicked." I get the idea that David is saying, "Lord, it's me, David. Listen, Lord. You aren't responding quickly enough to my requests, and it's kind of making me nervous now. You know my complaint, Lord, it's a lot like all my other complaints that you always wind up answering in your own time, but this time it's just really not fast enough from my perspective. Lord, why do you always wait to rescue me within inches of the disaster?" It's important to realize that the Hebrew language and the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew, and even the Latin version, the Vulgate, use much stronger language than we would discover here in English when we're unraveling the sense of this psalm. In fact, the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew, begins the psalm translation this way: I was grieved in my meditation and troubled because of the voice of my enemy. And I think they just see that David is here saying, Lord, I was meditating on who you were and really feeling oriented towards you and my relationship with you. And I was feeling so comfortable and cared for. And I was thinking about your holiness and your godliness and your righteousness and how good you are to me. And then I started getting disoriented because I was hearing how my enemies are talking to me, and it was getting in the way of my meditation of who you are. And then all I could think about was their hatred, and it was making me so restless that I was feeling like a transient, morally roving between different emotional states. The state of meditating on you and acknowledging how wonderful you are, and then hearing the hatred of my enemies for me, and it was making me really anxious. And then my grief started to express itself in my bodily restlessness. Lord, I was really uncomfortable. I was distraught and I was distracted. I was rushing around madly like I didn't know what I was doing. That's how deeply I was getting into each extreme. And I was feeling this compulsion to just, because I didn't know how else to vent my feelings. And then he says in verse 3, because of the voice of the enemy, because of the oppression of the wicked, for they bring down trouble on me, and in wrath they hate me. Lord, I was really getting anxious because the voices of the wicked were cherishing their hatred for me. And it was distracting me from understanding and loving who you are. It was like having a bad dream when you have a fever, where you're in this fever state and you keep having the same dream over and over again. It's a bad dream, and it's something you just can't awaken from. And then when you finally wake up, you're just troubled because, what a terrible state to be in. And he said that they bring down trouble on me. It's literally they're rolling down mischief on me in their hatred. And he's just staggering under the weight of this hatred that his enemies have for him. That word for wrath there is kind of interesting. It's the translation of the word nose or nostril. And so that their anger is expressed in the appearance of their nostrils. It's like, that's how much they hate me. Their nostrils are flaring out and they're just anxious to get to me. They hate me so much that their nostrils are flaring out. And he says in verse 4, my heart is severely pained within me, and the terrors of death have fallen on me. Fearfulness and trembling have come upon me, and horror has overwhelmed me. This is a serious psalm. David's in bad shape as he's talking to the Lord in this psalm. And he's just saying, look, Lord, look how I'm responding to this situation. I feel like I'm waiting for the dreaded horrors of death to come upon me, and it's actually making me physically pained. And then notice in verse 6, he kind of softens it a little bit, and he says, so I said, oh, that I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. Indeed, I would wander far off and remain at rest in the wilderness, Selah. Oh Lord, let me take a break in my worship and lift that idea up to you. Me getting away from here and resting so that I'm away from the wickedness and back to meditating on you again. Lift that idea up to the Lord, he's saying. Oh, I would hasten my escape from the windy storm and tempest. Now the hatred of his enemies is a storm and it's a tempest coming after him, and he's stuck in the middle of it. Lord, I just want to get out of here. Let me find that little cabin on Walden Pond where I'm away from the rat race and I'm just meditating on you. That's where I want to be. That's how bad this situation has gotten for me, Lord. Let me find some cave where I can meditate all day on your goodness and escape all this wickedness and hatred that I'm witnessing. Just let me find some quiet shelter off in the rocks somewhere by the sea where I'm away from this city and this hatred, where I can just focus on you. He actually says, Lord, give me the wings of a feral rock pigeon. You know how a pigeon will lodge in the city and kind of live in the top of the city, and it'll fly around, and he's just seeing the pigeons flying around looking at all this wickedness and an uncomfortable situation going on. And then he says, Lord, just give me the wings of a feral dove so I can get out of here and go live in the rocks somewhere by the ocean and just meditate on you away from this wickedness. Lord, would you just hear my prayer and deliver me from all these storms of life that keep exploding around me? And then we begin to see why David is so distraught in this psalm. Because he begins to draw this really distressing picture of what wickedness is. You'll note the descriptive kind of words that he begins using of wickedness, right? Violence, strife, iniquity, trouble, oppression, destruction, deceit. And he says in verse 9, destroy, O Lord, and divide their tongues, for I've seen violence and strife in the city. Day and night they, that is violence and strife, go around the city on its walls, he says. Iniquity and trouble are also in the midst of the city. Destruction is in its midst. Oppression and deceit do not depart from its streets. It's interesting, some commentators see David kind of in a weird spot here. They say, well, either some other psalmist has come along and inserted some other passages into this psalm, or else David is psychotic and bipolar. Because it doesn't make sense to them that he's going back and forth in this roller coaster of emotions between meditating and loving God's word and focusing on him, and then wanting his enemies to be destroyed in the same sentence almost. Because we see David going from one extreme of emotion to the other extreme throughout the rest of the psalm here. From calm and depending meditation on God to commanding God to terminate his enemies. And he's back and forth on this roller coaster for the rest of the psalm. And David's seeing all of this wickedness and deceit and guile right in the middle of town, he says. It's right in their streets, and it's obvious for everyone to see. And then he starts commanding God to literally swallow them up. Just engulf them quickly, devour them, drown them in the sea. Commanding God to cause division in their councils. It's like he's saying, Lord, do the Tower of Babel thing to all these enemies of mine. Make it so they don't understand each other. They can't come against me in their ideas, in their wickedness. And he says, I've seen violence and fighting and still see it. If you've been watching the news for the last couple of years and you've understood the situation between Palestine and Israel, you know that word violence. It's the word Hamas. Hamas is used almost always in connection with the most sinful kind of violence you could talk about. It's not used to refer to the violence that naturally occurs when you have an earthquake or a tsunami, that kind of a thing. And it's not talking about the violence that happens when the righteous are pursuing the wicked. Here, David personifies wickedness and violence as if it's some kind of beast living in the city. Violence and strife are occupying the city as if they're alive there, he's saying. And not only alive, but they're prowling about on its walls, he says. And this is causing rampant grief and panic and death everywhere. You know, the use of the word iniquity here is really interesting because it kind of explains the progressive nature of wickedness. And I think sometimes we all might be intrigued with that idea of beginning to think that there might be something positive in being wicked. Think about this. Maybe it's not so bad after all to be a little bit wicked anyway. God doesn't seem to be bringing judgment down on the wicked. He's allowing them to do whatever they want, and the church is suffering. We're being hated, and God doesn't seem to be doing anything about it. That's where David was heading in Psalm 73, if you remember. Maybe you begin to sort of contemplate playing around with trouble a little bit to get some of your revenge or your anxiety out. Maybe you start to become a little intrigued with the idea of getting away with trouble. And after a while, maybe you move on into flat out open wickedness because you're getting your revenge and God doesn't seem to be doing enough to be taking care of it. And then that wickedness can even become part of your passion. You know, as I said that, I immediately thought about a friend of mine whose daughter is going down to Portland in the riots every single night. Every night she's down there. It's become her passion now to go be disruptive and destructive. She's living for that now. And maybe soon you're so taken up with your own wickedness that you begin to worship it as your own special little idol. But notice in verse 12, David says, "For it's not an enemy who reproaches me, then I could bear it. Nor is it one who hates me who has exalted himself against me, then I could hide from him. But it was you, a man my equal, my companion and my acquaintance. We took sweet counsel together and walked to the house of God in the throng of Israel together." Notice how it's been they and them and their for the whole psalm so far. "For they bring down trouble upon me, and in wrath they hate me, they divide their tongues." In the next verse, he's going to say, "Let death seize them. Let them go down alive into hell, for wickedness is in their dwellings and among them." But now it's suddenly changed to you, and he's talking about a close friend. And then the full realization of the extent of wickedness comes around for David, as he realizes, you know what? Your best friend is in the same camp as all your enemies are who hate you. Lord, what kind of trouble is that you're bringing onto me? I mean, the one thing that you think about, the rampant sin everywhere, that's one thing. It's easy enough to deal with that. You can kind of ignore it a little bit. But now the level of sin is in relation to David, and it's really escalated now because if it's a friend of his. It was kind of just there all around me in the city, but now it's you, my friend, you're knocking on my porch. The wickedness is right there, and I'm forced to personally address it because I know who you are and you're being wicked toward me. It's one thing to acknowledge that sin is everywhere in the world and it affects all of society, but now it's really been intensified. The Septuagint and the Vulgate both say the same thing here. They say, this is how close David says he was to his friend. "You were one soul with me. You were my second self." That's how close we were. When I stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself, you were right next to me, the same as me. And you expect it when your known enemy openly hates you. You can be ready for that. That's why we call them enemies. But Lord, who knows how to get around a situation like this? How do you fight against treachery and fraud and deceit with someone who pretends to be with you in every sense? Look at the extent of the wickedness he's sensing here. And then he goes back to the other side again in verse 15, and he says, let death seize them. Let them go down alive into hell. For wickedness is in their dwellings and among them. See, they're not just wicked, but wickedness lives with them. Wickedness is all that they're about, he's saying. They live in wickedness. And then you kind of get the sense that David's saying, Lord, here it comes again, that roller coaster of extremes. I can feel myself, this compelling welling up that I want to start screaming again to get rid of the anxiety that I'm feeling because of this intense wickedness all around me. And then he says, Lord, just desolate them. Do the Korah thing. Remember in Numbers 16 when Korah challenged Moses about who was going to be the leader of the Levites? And Moses said, okay, we'll show up at the temple tomorrow morning and we'll see what God has to say. And then all of a sudden God rains down fire on these 250 men that are with Korah. And then he opens up the earth and all of their families of these 250 men and all their belongings fall into the pit. And then the next day the people come to Moses and they said, hey, you shouldn't have said anything. Look what happened. And then God rains down a plague on everyone and kills 14,700 people. Swallow them up, Lord. Bring the plagues. Don't hold anything back this time. Do the Korah thing to these people is what he's saying. And then you get the sense that David's sort of starting to calm down a little bit now. I think I've gotten it off my chest. It's all out in the open now, Lord. Now that you've heard me, I think I can find my way back into walking faithfully with you again. And notice how calm he is now in verse 16. Again, he's back and forth with these emotional upheavals. He says in verse 16, as for me, I will call upon God, and the Lord shall save me. Evening and morning and at noon, I will pray and cry aloud, and he shall hear my voice. He has redeemed my soul in peace from the battle that was against me, for there were many fighting against me. You almost get the sense that David going back and forth here is kind of saying, I'm going to keep praying like this, Lord, because it keeps me focused on you so I don't get distracted with all this wickedness and hatred that's getting in way of my relationship to you. And then he says in verse 19, God will hear and afflict them. And then he says something really, really intriguing to me. He says, even he who abides from of old, Selah. Lord, let me lift that idea up to you. You abiding from of old, you being here forever. You always existing. And then he says, because they do not change, therefore they do not fear God, talking about the wicked again. And he says, God is going to hear me and afflict them because God has been alive forever. You're the one in whose character there are no changes. And you know what? Everyone knows that, Lord. And yet somehow the wicked have no fear of you. That's the trait of the wicked, isn't it? They have no fear of the Lord. And I know too that you are sovereign over every area of my life because you've been around forever, Lord. Lord, you're sovereign over the enemy that's oppressing me day in and day out. Lord, you're sovereign over that random strife that's crawling all over the walls of Jerusalem, and you're sovereign over the sin that's alive and well in downtown Jerusalem and in Portland and in downtown Colton even. And you're sovereign over the life of that friend when he does that same kind of thing to me that the wicked do. You're sovereign over that too, Lord. And then he says in verse 20, he, that friend in particular that I've been talking about, that I didn't mention his name, has put forth his hands against those who were at peace with him. He has broken his covenant. The words of his mouth were smoother than butter, but war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords. Lord, I think David's just saying, Lord, I recognize that you're sovereign over his deceit and my friend's hatred for me. So, Lord, there's only one thing I can do in light of all these things that I've been expressing to you. And he says in verse 22, cast your burden on the Lord, and he shall sustain you. He shall never permit the righteous to be moved. And that's a command, he says in Hebrew, cast your burden on the Lord. And so he's saying, here's my command for all you readers. Here's some real take-home wisdom for you. Here's that wisdom I was asking you to ponder when I said that this is a Maskil psalm. This is a contemplation of mine. Reader, listen. In light of all that I've said, I'm commanding you to renounce your burdens, he says. Throw them away entirely and have nothing to do with them any longer. Set them on the sovereign will of the God that's been here forever. Wow, what a turnaround for David. And he says that's how God's going to sustain you while you walk in this life of faith that sometimes drops hand grenades all around you that you don't understand. The word sustain is in a really obscure Hebrew tense. In fact, I took several semesters of Hebrew, and I never heard of this tense before. But I know it's a causative and intensive tense, and let me help you to understand why that's an important tense to think about. Here's how a causative and intensive tense work together. In this tense, you wouldn't say he killed it. You'd say he was caused to slaughter it. You wouldn't simply say he broke it. In this tense, you'd say he was caused to crush it. You wouldn't say he didn't like it. You'd say he was caused to despise it. There's the intensified sense of it, and the causing something outside of you, causing you, making you to be this way. And so the word sustain can also mean to comprehend or to contain or to measure something out or hold it. And he's simply saying when you cast your burdens on the Lord, he's going to sustain you then. That becomes, he's going to cause you to be contained and held within the evil or the suffering or the anxiety when you cast your burdens on him. What amazing wisdom that is for us. He's going to cause you to endure it. His sovereign, providentially guiding hand is going to cause you to be contained within it. He's going to cause you to be sustained in the midst of that experience. Wow, that's amazing. He's going to, I like this the best, he's going to hold you within the boundaries that he's measured that trial out for you when you cast your burdens on him. That's how God is going to cause it to be comprehended for you when you cast all your burdens on him. And so here's how David has learned to deal with all this negative emotion and anxiety and bitterness he's been experienced that's caused him to be disoriented with God. Remember what we said back at the beginning of the psalm? He thought that running away and hiding, that might be an option for him. Running away for it might work. Wandering around like a transient, that might be an option to deal with this. Or you could just be fearful and troubled all day. That's something he thought about. Or maybe just being horrified. That was a tempting solution. Another thing David thought of was just destroy them. Send them down into Sheol, into the pit. That was high on the list of David's thoughts on how to deal with the anxiety. Being angry and retaliating against my friend, that might be an option. But he settles for this instead. He says, tell God exactly how you feel within the range of emotions that you're experiencing, and then cast all of those burdens that you've openly expressed to him on his sovereign, providential, guiding hand. That's the way he's going to reorient you back into your relationship of faith with him. That's how he's going to continue in that dark side of walking in faith with the Lord, when it seems impossible for you to comprehend or endure the experience in your own thinking. Peter shared that same thing in the first epistle of Peter. Remember when he was saying, look at when they revile you day in and day out, cast all your care upon him, for he cares for you. Same place that occurs. So listen, folks, David is just saying this. If you really want to remain unmoved and unconfused and entirely oriented to God while you live this life of faith, which is sometimes really disorienting in light of the circumstances we experience, David is just saying this: go ahead and express those concerns to God exactly the way you feel them. And then give those burdens all away to the Lord and take him as your pilot and your guide and your assurance. And rest all of your life, not just your burdens, all of your concerns and all of your fears on his providential care. And when you do that, you'll be able to pray with David with this kind of assurance that he ends the psalm with. In verse 23, he says, but you, O God, shall bring them down to the pit of destruction. Bloodthirsty and deceitful men shall not live out half their days, but I will trust you. Notice how he comes back again to the hopeful end. He's done with, destroy them now. It's almost as if he's saying, Lord, I promise this is the last time I'm going to remind you of what you've promised to do. This is the last time I'm mentioning what I'm expecting you to do, Lord. When you contain me in all of this, when you comprehend all of this for me, I'm assured that anyone who presumes to ensnare the righteous will be consigned to unending punishment. Exactly the same place he winds up in Psalm 73. When I cast my burdens on you and I lay all of my life in the care of your providence, I will be caused to remain unmoved, because bloodthirsty and deceitful men will not live out half their days. Do you see how David brought this all the way around again to a hopeful end in light of the experience he was feeling with all these wicked people around him? A.W. Pink said this as I close the sermon here in his studies on the scriptures. He said, there are seasons in the lives of all men when it's not easy, no, not even for Christians, to believe that God is always faithful. Our faith is sorely tried, our eyes unable to focus because of the tears at times, and we can no longer trace how his love is intersecting with our lives. Our hearts are distracted with the noise of the world, noises that remind us that sin is everywhere. And we're harassed by the God-hating whispering of our enemies, who so remind us again that if God really cared for you, he wouldn't allow those kinds of troubles to come into your life. And so you had some cherished plans that got thwarted. And you were staggered by the fact that they got so thwarted. And you sought to be faithful to God, and now there's a dark cloud hiding him from you. And we find it nearly impossible in our carnal reason to harmonize his frowning providence with his gracious promises. How do we put this together? Folks, listen, even the prophets of God experienced times of spiritual darkness. Just read Lamentations chapter 2 when you go home today. And we shouldn't be surprised or dismayed if we find ourselves there as well. But the truth of the matter is, sometimes we discover that the treasures of wisdom and the knowledge of God's ways are the greatest when we find ourselves under the shadow of God's hidden providence. It's then that David reminds us in this Maskil psalm to acknowledge and then cast all of our burdens upon his providential care, so that we'll begin to come out on the other side of those experiences where we become reoriented to God again because we've reflected on his character and on his providential care. Well, I have a feeling that Wednesday morning when we wake up, there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be lamenting. But we know how to take care of that now, don't we? We know that God is provident. We know that God is sovereign in our lives. We know that God doesn't protect us from all evil and wickedness. But we know how to deal with it when we reflect and speak openly to him about the things that are most concerning for us and our anxiety. And then reorienting ourselves back into his character and his good graces again. Let me pray for us. Father, what a great message your psalm is to us. We thank you that your wisdom is for us, that you desire that we contemplate who you are in the midst of all of our experiences, that we lay our lives, our very lives, and our thoughts and our actions on your providential care. Father, in the midst of those experiences, help us to praise you and to cause our hearts to lift up your name and to glorify you even when things aren't going the way we think they should. Father, be a blessing to us today as we depart and as we go forward. Cause us to reflect on this great truth we've heard in Psalm 55. And may your name be praised and lifted up in our hearts with everyone that we come in contact with today. And we thank you in Christ's precious name. Amen.